Let's do this. So everybody, my name is Isela Peña-Rager, and I think I want to mention first that we are recording this session. I'll mention it again later as more people join us. But my name is Isela Peña-Rager. I use she, her pronouns. I'm one of the co-chairs along with Colin, who's here and will be introducing himself in just a little bit. And I am also an assistant director for the College of Letters and Science, undergraduate advising. And let's see. This is the community conversation, equity-oriented leadership coaching session, which is going to be in the form of a moderated panel today. CCN is what we call ourselves for short. So CCN is a community of practice staff organization sponsored by Berkeley People and Culture for employees at UC Berkeley with the goal of bringing the campus events focused on building coaching skills and a coaching culture. So our sessions include a real general mix of knowledge exchange, social learning, community conversations, skills practice, dialogue, reflection, and networking. If you would like to, please check out the Cal Coaching Network website for links to materials from previous sessions. I'll just give a really quick recap of what we've done since we've been in shelter in place. In August, we practiced open-ended questions in our powerful question session. In the June session, CCN collaborated with our friends in the Advancing Practice Student Services group that has I think it's over 1,000 people on that listserv. And it was focused on equity-oriented academic coaching. So we had folks from the student-facing side of the house. Our April session focused on strategies for effective coaching in a remote environment, which was extremely timely, of course. So this session, again, will be recorded in speaker view, and then it will be uploaded to the CCN website for those who were unable to attend today, and also just if you want to go back and look at it and share it and keep the conversation going. Today, we are super thrilled to bring forward a critical community conversation about equity and leadership coaching in the workplace at UC Berkeley. If this is your first time participating in a CCN session, we thank you for your presence and time and for welcoming us into your space. For those returning, wonderful to see you again. I see a lot of familiar names. So glad to have you here contributing to building a coaching culture at Cal. As we near Cal Coaching Network's 1-year mark in December, I'd like to take a quick moment to thank everyone who's engaged in any way in the network. You're the reason for this network's traction, growth, and evolution. You're part of this big team building a stronger culture, coaching culture, a better employee experience. And I'll pass it over to Colin.
Hey, everybody. Oh my gosh, hi. Thank you so much for your time today and for your engagement and participation in today's community conversation. I'm Colin Gerker, I use he, him pronouns. I work in people and culture and our people and organization development team as a consultant in learning design and organization development, all kinds of fun stuff. I'm also the co-chair of the Cal Coaching Network with the wonderful Isela, and I'm so thankful to be with you today and honored. So really quickly, what is coaching? The way we sort of define it here at UC Berkeley is partnering with an individual in a thought-provoking and creative process that helps individuals maximize their personal and professional potential. Coaching can be done informally or formally. Coaching happens when somebody's listening to understand and asks open-ended, powerful questions. The coach helps discover, explore, plan, and act, really supporting an individual in their success. The coachee is the one that does the work, all right? So let's just keep those mindsets aligned and thinking about relationships, but also about how an organization, UC Berkeley, can enable an environment and a community for folks to be able to thrive. So when we're thinking about, okay, well, what has UC Berkeley been doing to build a coaching culture in the last few years or so? Thinking about 2019 to 2020, about half of UC Berkeley's managers and supervisors have taken the Growing as a Coach class, Berkeley People Management 206. There's a class tomorrow. Ying Kwa, if you're here, I know you're maybe out there. She and I are going to be co-facilitating that tomorrow. So we so thank all of the managers who have gone through that course and have started to bring back that knowledge and that perspective to other folks in their units to say, this is good for us. It's going to help our employees grow. And I want to become better at helping develop, and enable employees in their success. Speaking about enabling success in our organization, Achieve Together is our new performance development program for non-represented employees, which if you look at the achievement criteria, so what are we being evaluated on here as non-represented employees, it actually calls out that the supervisor is responsible for enabling growth and development of employees. So it says, as managers, we're doing work, but we're also responsible for supporting people in their growth. That's a big structural shift. We also have the Cal Coaching Network. This session marks over 1,000 participants in less than a year in our variety of sessions. So we want to thank you so much for being participatory and present. There's multiple organizations on campus divisions who have local coaching circles. That's peer groups coming together to say, all right, we are all supervisors and managers together. Let's support each other in doing that. Let's support each other in how we are building coaching skills and culture and access to coaching within our units. We also have our Korn Ferry 360 developmental assessments. These are personalized and confidential feedback analysis where you get to build your own personalized professional development plan. We also have our brand new Berkeley People Management Executive Coaching Program, where 25 rising leaders at Berkeley are going through that process of doing those 360s and then getting 6 months of confidential coaching from a certified professional, which is incredibly exciting. Again, expanding that access to types of coaching. And then we have one-on-one career coaching from Linda Lundberg and Lisa Reichert on the People and Culture team. And we have one-on-one coaching for performance offered by myself and the wonderful Jan Crosby Taylor in People and Organization Development. So again, working with folks in a different type of coaching capacity, getting support in thinking about how do I want to be a better coach? How can I be better at being coachable? And then also, it's the everyday interactions through our networks, our collaborations, our peers. It's coaching diagonally, sideways, crisscross, applesauce. It's thinking about our world as a dynamic environment and how we are all engaging in that coaching and coachability. Today's session is going to focus on an equity-oriented framework for coaching and telling stories about that. Thinking about ourselves and how we self-define. We're going to hear a little bit about that in a moment. Thank you all so much for filling out the survey before you came to the space today. We're also going to be thinking about relationships, our community, and organizations, and hearing stories about that. So there were 72 individuals that filled out a quick survey about what does equity-oriented coaching mean to you. And I randomly selected 6 examples. I'm going to share those with you just to give some perspective. And then we're going to turn it over to our wonderful moderator and panel for today. So these are not associated with anybody's name. So no one's getting called out here, but these are really amazing and beautiful because they show a variety of perspectives. The first, equity-oriented coaching means striving towards justice in our everyday interactions. It means understanding and practicing cultural humility. It means constantly growing in your coaching approach and actively working towards eradicating white supremacy and all of its toxic characteristics. It means making mistakes and trying again the next day. Another perspective, it means opportunities are given regardless of race, ethnicity, class, gender, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. Another perspective, understanding your power and privilege when coaching, while at the same time supporting and advocating vulnerable communities. It also means clearing your own side of things through awareness so that you know how you are making an impact in the situation. If beliefs and biases go unnoticed and unattended or unaddressed on the part of the coach, it limits the ability to coach and the relationship for trust to be built. It means building up strengths and valuing a person's perspective. This person said, I think of coaching needing to become like water, constantly checking the pH and adjusting to keep her energy as clean and clear as possible. We also put together a very quick word cloud that shows out of the 72 responses, what were the amazing perspectives that were shown here. So just to give kind of an idea, there weren't a lot that were kind of rising to the top. And I think that what that shows is that we're going to hear a lot today about it. I'm going to tell my own story. I'm going to share my own perspective about what this means. And you all were really, really incredible in providing those perspectives. So this slide deck is already on our website. You can access that and see the word cloud. One take I'd like to share with you is adopted from Elena Aguilar's book on coaching for equity. She's an Oakland native. If you haven't looked at the book yet, it's great. You can get it on Amazon. And this is adapted from her perspective. Everybody gets what they need from the organization, regardless of where they came from, what they look like, their temperament, or what they show up knowing or not knowing. Everybody gets what they need every day in order to have all the skills and tools to pursue whatever they want in their career and development. Equity is about outcomes, experiences for every employee every day. So taking a look at our quick kind of focus areas for today, our learning objectives, we'd ask that you would reflect on one thing that you currently do that helps promote equity and inclusion in your work, whether you're a supervisor or a non-supervisor, or leading teams, leading initiatives. Name one thing you might change in your leadership or coaching to promote equity and inclusion. And think about what would be most beneficial for your continued learning when it comes to equity-oriented leadership or coaching. And hang on to that question, because what we're going to be doing is make sure to pay attention to our survey that will come out at the end of our session, because we're going to take what was learned there, thinking about these learning objectives, and build a really exciting skills practice, taking what we learned today for our session in December. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Isela.
Thank you so much, Colin. Your energy is always off the hook. I appreciate it so much. I'd like to take a moment to briefly introduce and thank our incredible moderator, and also thank our inspirational panelists for today's community conversation. Our conversation will be moderated by AVC and Chief People and Culture Officer, Eugene Whitlock. Eugene, your presence and leadership in this space is so valuable, and we thank you for guiding the dialogue and for sharing your time, support, and insights. Joining us on the panel today are 4 outstanding leaders who bring their own unique experiences, perspectives, and stories to the table. The moderator and the panelists will have time to introduce themselves in a few moments. Before that, I'd like to offer CCN's gratitude for your participation, all of you, in the conversation, for your time and openness to share your distinct and important experiences. So thank you again to Eugene, panelists, CCN leadership team, and a special shout out to our ethnic staff organizations. We reached out to you and you nominated panelists that are here with us today. For this session, we invited nominees from the Asian Pacific American System-Wide Alliance, otherwise known as APASA, and the Native American Staff Council, NASC. CCN is committed to collaborating with our ethnic staff orgs and identity-based staff orgs for future sessions. And with that, I'll hand it over to Eugene Whitlock.
Thank you very much, Isela. And you can stop sharing the screen so we can all see. There we go. We can all see each other, Hollywood Squares top. I want to thank Colin and Isela for hosting this event, and also the 180 plus of you who also joined us for what I think is going to be an interesting and important conversation. I plan to ask only one softball question of each of the panelists. The rest, I'm going to grill them. So at a minimum, be entertaining. On the serious, I also want to thank everybody for joining us, because there is a recognition of the importance of this work that we're trying to do and really change how we do things at UC Berkeley. And the fact that so many of you are involved and continue to be involved says to me that we are going in the right direction, and we are going to make this a great place to work for everybody, regardless of life experience, background, age, gender, ethnicity, you name it. Berkeley will be the place where you can feel most welcome. So I will start with the softball question, which I'll ask to all of the panelists, but I'll start with Regina, Dr. Regina Stanback-Stroud, because she is our guest. So tell us about your experiences with coaching, that is, experiences you have being coached and coaching others.
Yes, thank you very much, Eugene. And thank you to all of you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity. I love the fact that my family and my network has expanded to include all of you and to include UC Berkeley. I feel like I have new friends and colleagues, and am all the more smarter because of it. So thank you so much. Really easily, my experience in coaching was about a decade ago or so. I became the president of Skyline College, and I had come through the institution, as a faculty member, and then the typical or traditional trajectory as a dean and a vice president, and became the president. And I enter the space with, I take up a lot of air in the room sometimes, and my personality is pretty, assertive and forthright and direct. And so I realized that I was taking on a position that, had, some very specific political aspects to it. And so I engaged a coach, if I were, kind of really just being blunt, so that I didn't make a mistake and cuss somebody out on the first day. I wanted to make sure that, I entered the space in a way that, was receptive and open and that kind of stuff. And so I engaged a coach to, in all fairness, think about, some polish around that, and stayed with that coach for about 10 years, as a matter of fact, and learned a lot and grew a lot as a result of it, and didn't even know there was such a thing as a real field of coaching. I just knew that she modeled the disposition that I was interested in, and I wanted her to teach me how to get there. And then I retired after 35 years in the system, and found that I was in the role of constantly either being asked to coach someone or mentor someone or consult. And all of those have different definitions, but I decided to actually get smarter about it, that I needed to be a lot more responsible with people's futures if I was going to be the expert on it. So I entered Howard University's Coach Diversity Institute and went through the process to become an ICF certified coach, and I'm finishing that up this week.
Thank you, Regina. And next, going to the home team now. Kristin, same questions for you. Your experience as being coached and coaching others.
Thanks everyone. I'm Kristin Theis-Alvarez. I'm the Dean of Admissions and Financial Aid at Berkeley Law. I'm excited to be here. I was asked by someone who was asked by someone, and as classic for me, didn't feel like I could say no, but I'm feeling somewhat, I don't know, intimidated is not the right word, excited and welcomed, but also, vaguely like interested in how this is going to go. In part because I think I'm an interesting juxtaposition to what the first panelist just shared, which is I don't think I've ever been formally coached, right? I didn't grow up, come up, move up professionally in a way where anyone ever said to me, there's this thing called coaching and you should think about doing it, and here's an opportunity for you. I think I had a lot of informal coaches, and one of the experiences that stands out for me is working in the space that I work in now, but under someone who was a man of color who had been doing the role for a very long time, or a slightly different role, and I could tell was sort of helping me think about whether I would want to move into that role, because he was starting to see retirement on the horizon. Was able to have a series of conversations with him over a long period of time, kind of about coming to terms with imposter syndrome, and what that meant in terms of the way that it might be inhibiting my own sense of growth or opportunity, how to sort of practically combat it and manage it, and then what things to do moving forward. So that was really transformative for me, because I needed someone to create this space for me to imagine being a leader at UC Berkeley in a particular kind of way. That was really, I think, my introduction to the ability of coaching, whether it's formal or informal, and this was pre, Cal Coaching Network, to make an impact for employees who either personally may or may not feel seen, or who have aspects of their identity that may or may not feel like they are able to be seen or talked about in a workplace environment. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Kristin. Marcia, your turn. You unmuted, you moved. I'm calling on you now. Shall I repeat the question?
It's okay, Eugene. Thank you very much. I knew you were coming for me. That's why I unmuted. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Marcia G. Riley. Thank you so much for having me in this really welcoming space. I use she, her pronouns, and I, along with Kristin, am very humbled to be on this panel. Similarly, I was nominated for this opportunity and wanted to decline, and at the same time, was incredibly honored to be asked to share in this space. So I'm a Cal alum. I came to Berkeley as an undergrad way back in 1984. And I actually began my career on campus as a student employee over 30 years ago, checking IDs at the rec sports facility on campus. So that's how I started my career. And as a career employee, I think I found myself in a lot of different roles and found myself in situations where I was given opportunities for advancement, but with very little training. I'm sure nobody else has had that experience on campus, but that was mine. I think people saw me as a doer, and so I was promoted, but as we all know, it takes a lot more than being a hard worker to actually manage and lead people. So all of this to say that I didn't get a lot of coaching actually in the beginning of my career. And it was a lot of trial by fire. And I felt like I had to figure things out for myself, which meant that I was making a lot of mistakes. And in hindsight, I think, I've learned to celebrate my mistakes, right? Because I think I did a lot of learning through those mistakes, but it also really forced me to seek out coaching and mentorship outside of my department because I wasn't getting it in those spaces. So in the early 90s, I actually joined APASA. Initially it was just a way of like meeting people outside of my department and finding some social events on campus. But what I found was like this great resource of experienced staff people on the campus who actually ended up coaching me through some of the most challenging situations in my career. And without it, I can actually really confidently say that I wouldn't have survived my time without that network. So I really applaud everybody who's here today in being part of CCN. I think these are the spaces that really help people not just survive, but thrive as staff on campus. So as a woman, and especially an Asian woman, and sometimes the only woman of color at the table, I really needed that coaching and encouragement to find my voice in those spaces. I needed help in navigating the microaggressions, the politics, the power dynamics that I think I experienced, and I'm sure many of you have as well in your careers. And being coached really inspired me in turn to coach other people. And helping them figure out how to navigate this crazy place and to really strive for the needs and goals that they had for themselves. And sometimes it was, coaching people to leave, unfortunately, because, they weren't able to actually have their needs met. And I think what I would lastly say is that in my day-to-day role, in my current role as the director and ombudsperson for students, I have the privilege actually of coaching students and postdocs, and I consult with faculty and staff on coaching them in communication and conflict resolution skills. So I feel very blessed to actually be in a position that allows me to do this work every day.
Thank you very much, Marcia. Crazy place is a very good description for UC Berkeley. Lasana is a recent person to join this crazy place. Lasana, are you ready to answer the 2 softballs?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for Cal Coaching Network for inviting me to be a part of the panel. And I'm really honored to be amongst this distinguished group that's been assembled. In terms of coaching, I think I'm a synthesis of all of my colleagues on the panel. I've had my first professional coaching experience being coached was informal. It was at Arizona State University, and a guy named Alonzo Jones. And when I first started working in the Multicultural Student Center, he was the director of the Multicultural Student Center. And it was the first time in a supervisory capacity where someone really took a coaching approach, where he was talking about goals, talking about things I wanted to achieve, and then kind of posing questions to me that forced me to critically think and then begin to act and work in a very strategic way around my career. And it really set a tone for me as a professional, as one of being a person that was critically self-reflective and aware, but also how I should work as a supervisor. And so that's where my really first coaching came from, was a dual role. He served as both a mentor and a coach. Formal coaching, actually, I was formally coached for the first time by the same person who Dr. Stanback Stroud had hired. Once Dr. Stanback Stroud had retired, I joined the executive cabinet at the college, and that particular coach has the responsibility of working with the entire executive cabinet. And that was the first time where I worked at that level as getting that advice as an executive, right? And getting that type of coaching as an executive, where I could see the difference between the coaching and the mentoring, but also a different accent on certain type of stretch goals in terms of working, and then also the kinds of questions about chemistry with my other execs, right? And it was a lot of focus on that, about how do we become a greater than the sum of our whole, right? And so that was very important and instructive for me in my career. As a coach, I have not gone through any kind of coaching certification, but I have taken that approach with anyone that was ever under my employ, or anyone who was a direct report. My first meeting with my direct reports ever is, where is this at in your career trajectory? Where do you ultimately want to be? And how can I be a support to help get you there, right? And those are the kind of conversations that we begin with. And as we begin to work together over time and we have those check-ins, we begin to look at what are those opportunities and possibilities, and then also give that very candid feedback as a coach on where we said we wanted to be and how we are there. So that's my response to that question.
Thank you. So sticking with you, Lasana, because you talked about those first conversations that you have with employees. So how do you weave in, DEI principles, being inclusive, into your mentoring, coaching, formal, informal of others?
It's a couple of ways. One of the ways in which I address it is I address it individually, and I address it organizationally, because I think that there needs to be some type of connection there. So individually, meaning that based on the person's, the way in which they identify, talking about what role that identity plays within their career aspirations and the goals. Some of the obstacles that may be unique, right? Whether they're gender obstacles, whether they're sexual orientation obstacles, or whether they're race or ethnicity obstacles. What are the kinds of things and the dynamics that are there, and how they interpret how those obstacles or how those barriers that are structural are going to impact them in their identities, right? In their positionality. And so I talk from that, but then I also talk about the structure, right? And about how to be able to show up authentically, your whole full self, right? By having a particular standard of excellence, production, and innovation, right? To where you begin to mitigate those barriers that are either implicit or explicitly there. And so the way in which I engage it is very candid and very frank. Let's talk about your identities. Do you perceive that there's any barriers based on your identities? Do you perceive that there's any opportunities based on your identities? And then how do we leverage those in a meaningful way, depending on your career trajectory?
And I'll open it up to the other panelists to unmute. Same sort of question. Do you have a frank conversation with people you supervise? So for example, I've never had a manager say to me, Eugene, I see that you're Black. How do you think that affects your role here at UC Berkeley, or you name it? How do the three of you address these issues?
Well, Eugene, I'd be glad to speak to that. One of the things that I'm particularly conscious of is using my position, whatever position I'm in, to either set a tone, give permission, drive an agenda. And so I show up unapologetically Black. I show up explicitly revealing my commitment to anti-racist work, and explicitly working to make sure that the outcomes and experiences of people of color particularly cannot be predicted, that we have equitable experiences so that these experiences cannot be predicted by race. Because if either, I must believe that it's something inherently a problem with the population of people, or that there is a structure in place that is designed to produce those outcomes and to produce those experiences. That is the manifestation of structural racism. So I show up questioning, how is racism working here? If I'm looking at my organization and I see that people are aggregated at the bottom in terms of status and differentiation of status and power, and that's an aggregation of people of color. And when you look higher in the organization or at different positions, you don't see people of color, then my question is not what's wrong with them or how do they need to be taught to navigate the system, or my question is how do we make sure that we create a structure that they don't have to be taught to navigate a racist system, that we deconstruct the structural racism that may be at play. My question is usually how is racism working here? So when you ask me what I do to kind of think about diversity and equity and inclusion in the coaching, I come with a leadership framework. I come with a framework that says I acknowledge that white supremacy, for an example, I acknowledge that white supremacy is a universal construct. It is not unique to these United States. It is a pillar upon which this nation was established, the government was founded, the Constitution was created, and it influences formal and informal relationships, and that it is part of the social and political constructions that are part of the discrimination against women and people of color, which is why you are even having to have this conversation, particularly people of African descent, and that it remains embedded in our American political, economic, religious, and educational institutions. So when you show up with that framework, then that is a lens through which you can approach the work and your commitment through the organization from an ideological stance, not from a checklist of make sure I do this, make sure I ask powerful questions, acknowledge their culture, etc. I am able to do it from an ideological stance, which in turn then frees me to bring my whole self to the work.
All right, so that's a good response, but I'm going to ask you the follow-up. You open the door. How successful have you been in creating these equitable workplaces? You've been at a couple different organizations. And what have the impediments been to achieving the success that you wanted to?
That is a perfect question, because I really do believe that we, I do believe that we as institutional leaders, or we in our positions, if we say that, I heard someone say earlier that we are held accountable, that actually some supervisors are held accountable for the diversity and equity and inclusion work. But the reality is, are we really? So first, I will tell you that I've been in some places not so successful, and then in some places very successful. And some of it has been related to my positions and the power that comes with the quote unquote positional power that comes. And some has been related to my ability to influence and persuade regardless of the position that I've been in. So I'll give you the example of hiring faculty at Skyline College. When I first started becoming the president, when I first became the president there, I had initially about 7 faculty hiring processes going on at one time. And at that time, it was really exciting because we were hiring and many of the institutions were cutting their budgets. But when I got through the process at about the 6th level of finalists, I realized that out of these thousands of applications and hundreds of people that are interviewed and paper screened and 30 finalists that ultimately got to me, every single one of them would classify themselves as white. And so I stopped and said, wait, hold it. What is it about our practices, processes, and procedures are systematically excluding people of color from our hiring processes? And when I did that, as a leader, I was able to hold the institution accountable. I didn't call anybody racist. I said, let's deconstruct our processes. And that's exactly what we did. The result was that we changed a lot, worked with the Human Resources Office at that time, which was under your leadership. Yeah, so if I got that wrong, it's your fault. No, I'm kidding. We changed a lot. And I would say that of the teaching faculty, and I don't mean the Puente counselor, which is commonly held by a person of color, the equity, diversity specialist, etc. I mean the physics faculty, sociology faculty, psychology faculty, math faculty, English faculty. We reached, of the people that I had the opportunity to hire, I was able to hire about 65% of them were people of color. That was significantly different than what had been happening at the institution. So I've been quite successful with that, and successful with taking on the responsibility of when I get all that talent and attract all that talent, I don't expect to keep all that talent, because if I'm doing, I think if I'm doing a service to the institution and to them, then I am coaching and supporting for their progression so that they can make those contributions in other areas of the institution, hopefully.
Thank you. And so Marcia, I see you unmuted. Go right ahead.
Oh, remind me to keep my hands off the keyboard, Eugene. Well, you know, I really appreciate everything that Regina just said. And I think just from my experience, I try to approach it, you know, from an individualistic approach, I guess, in terms of looking at the people and the folks that I'm leading, or my individual staff members, to sort of make sure that I'm looking at them as individuals, right? I think I heard Lasana reference this before, you know, in approaching it in a way to really get to know people for who they are, to sort of check my own unconscious bias, right? Not to make assumptions about people or how they think or who they are by how they present. And so really investing the time, I think, in understanding people individually and what their needs and goals and wants are, along with really sort of lifting up the differences amongst the team, right? Amongst folks, so that there's an embracing and a space where people feel like they're actually valued for their differing opinions and perspectives, right? I know so often it's easier to be around people who are like-minded or who look like yourself, and I think really ultimately, if we're gonna build these spaces, these equitable spaces, it really is important to create that trust and that relationship by actually lifting up the individuals for what they contribute, you know, to the team. And so I think that, you know, those are some of the ways that I try to approach.
And so, Marcia, when you spoke earlier in your initial remarks, you more or less said that that's not the kind of relationship you had with the people who supervised you. And so I imagine there are a lot of people had a very similar experience to yours. And so how would you say they approach a supervisor who isn't creating that kind of environment where they're lifting up different voices and valuing different experiences? How do they coach their coach?
Whew, okay. You know, honestly, I think that those are the most challenging times, especially because of power dynamics, right? I mean, you're in situations where you are confronted with individuals who hold power in some way, whether it's their positionality, whether it's their identity, you know, their privilege. And I think, honestly, again, this is where I default to relationships, right? In approaching people in a way where I am assuming the best and not the worst, right? So, you know, being able to go into the conversation, maybe on the front end, calling out, you know, I'm going to assume that your intention was the best, and that when you made that comment or you said that thing, that you didn't have any idea the impact that it may have had. So, you know, I try to enter into those conversations, allowing the person to feel like I am not making poor assumptions or attacking them in a way where they feel like they have to take defense, but that they feel like I'm trying to engage them in a constructive conversation to then be able to lead to, okay, what is it that I really want and need? You know, so that we can work together in moving forward in a better way.
And how successful has that approach been? And I ask from the perspective of, because not everything's going to work, but just to give people a sense that sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. You know, I mean, honestly, Eugene, this is where, though, I think really spending the time investing in building relationships is critical, right? Because if somebody trusts you and trusts that you are coming to them with the best of intent, you know, I think that goes a really long way in having the most difficult conversations. And so I think that's what I would add.
Thank you. Kristin, you want to jump in and react to anything that you've heard? I haven't forgotten that you're there.
No, it's been really interesting. And one of the benefits of talking last is that I can sort of pick a bunch of things that other people already said and weave them together. And I think the things that have been shared by other panelists have been really helpful. It's partly just interesting to reflect on how little space we all create in our own lives to think about our coaching. And, you know, if this is the beginning for each of us to just think about that practice and to create space and time for that, it's going to pay off in the long run. But, you know, I think to pick up on something that was said earlier, this concept of bringing your whole self into the workplace and the workspace is so critical. And one of the things that we have to do then is model that. Right? Because there's underpinnings of trust, relationship-based coaching, but also recognizing that because of systemic racism and structural barriers to equity and inclusion, there's different levels of risk, real or perceived, for people in terms of taking chances and bringing their whole selves in, right? Like the calculus about whether or not it feels culturally appropriate to insert yourself in a team meeting, the calculus about whether or not you think you're gonna play into someone's stereotypes about being too angry or too outspoken or too loud, plays into people's assessment of their risk and whether they wanna bring their whole selves in. One of the things that really interests me as a manager is kind of both for my team and for the organization, for the university, the opportunity cost of not having people bring their whole selves in, right? Like what could we do if everybody felt comfortable kind of being who they were in a particular kind of way? So the questions I think that are helpful to ask employees are things like, what do you care about? Right? Like, why do you come? Why do you do this job? What matters to you? And then also being willing to, you know, talk about that yourself. One funny thing about UC Berkeley is that a lot of people who work here could make a lot more money in the private sector, but we care about something about the institution and we share that in common. But I think we miss the boat if we don't ask people why they're showing up and give them a space to actually express that. And I've certainly had employees who, you know, felt like they were hitting their head against the wall over and over again because they had received the message that to be good at the job, they had to be really good with Excel, right? And they were not going to be really good with Excel. But that when asked the question, what do you care about? They talked about being an immigrant to this country, being a newcomer in high school, learning English, and how important it was to them to provide the kind of access to higher education that they had been able to receive. And so when we sort of were able to talk about what was motivating, both to connect to why it might be helpful to learn to crunch numbers more, right, as we express the importance of diversity, but also just maybe there were other goals, opportunities, trainings, and things that we could do that would make that person feel not just that they were more seen, but also they would absolutely be adding value to the work that we were doing, that we were missing this huge piece of who they were, and that in doing so, we were also missing this huge piece of contribution that they could make.
So now that you open the door to that theme, I'm going to ask it. Might be a little bit personal, but have you had to work in places where you couldn't bring your whole self to work, and you experienced stereotype threat and these other things, and couldn't perform to your potential? And if so, how did you navigate that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I want to say we all have, but then I wonder who the we is in that sentence. Yes. I struggle personally with the extent to which I might self-censor in certain situations, and whether that's actually real, like whether I'm correct in my assessment about whether that would be welcome or not. I remember a really transformative conversation with someone who didn't work at Berkeley, but worked in my field for another organization, who was encouraging me to express a sort of what I thought would be an unpopular opinion about something related to rising tuition and the impact on diversity, right? And to sort of lean into my perspective as an Indigenous person, as a person of color, as a first-gen student, as a low-income student who came to Berkeley through affirmative action and then went on to law school. Like, how I could talk about the barriers to access and things around financial aid and cost and how that might impact people. And that if I didn't talk about those things, it actually wasn't being particularly effective at being an advocate and doing the job that was the whole reason I showed up in the first place, right? That felt super risky. And then I was lucky in that it felt like it was rewarded. And so that sort of reaffirmed a commitment to that. But absolutely, I've worked in places where I think we don't talk about racial identity, we don't talk about gender, don't talk about things like being a parent, you don't talk about things like mental health challenges. There's just a whole range of identities that we're making choices about all the time about whether to bring them in or not. But I can also guarantee that we've probably interacted with employees who, if we had known that there was something that they were struggling with and would value from being able to benefit from being able to work from home sometimes if they were navigating something like depression, we would have retained that employee and right. And so to not that you need people to have to talk to you about things that's going on in their lives, but to not create the space for them to share that meant that we've probably lost a fair number of people who actually might have been incredible folks for the organization long-term.
Same question for the other panelists. How have you navigated the experiences of like having to sort of moderate who you are? Lasana.
I wanted to speak a little bit to that, and I'm glad that the conversation went in that direction, because you said you've never been to a job and someone's like, hey, Eugene, you're Black, let's talk about it, right? Most of my work has been directly in a diversity, equity, inclusion space. Even when I had responsibilities that were just like the Dean of Students and they didn't have that, I was in spaces where there was predominantly Black, Latinx, Pacific Islander, First Nation folks within the organization. And so it's like being in a job that has that in the title, addressing identity is a bit different than when you're in a job that so-called is generic, right? So I've never really had to have those kind of issues, and I can address identity directly. But another thing is like kind of like the way in which the theme of today's panel is coaching and equity. Dr. Stanback-Stroud kind of demonstrates and animates something that I really want to touch upon, which is when you are equity-minded and when you are anti-racist, the things that you produce are equity-minded and anti-racist, right? There's no other way you can produce it because your ideology, you embody it, right? And so when you start having these conversations about this particular framework, and then if you aren't embodying the framework, then it just becomes this cerebral thing. So when you have an outcome, when you have an output, the output should be reflective of what you value, right? So if you are going to challenge systemic oppression, right? Hopefully you should not create anything that develops systemic oppression. So I say that to say is that there's a difference between being strategic within the organization in which you advocate for, when you advocate, the type of language you use, the type of proposals you put forth, right? That's not compromising yourself if you are on task and on agenda. There's a difference between that and just totally saying, I'm not going to speak to anything that addresses some of the inequities within the organization as an act of self-preservation. Those are two totally different types of things. And so I think that those who do not have that privilege that I have, which is to work in identity-based spaces, and so I can have those candid conversations, is to really figure out, what do I really embody? What are my values, and how do my values show up in everything that I produce, right? In every idea that I put forth, in every initiative that I support. And if there's a distance between your values and what you're producing in the workplace, those are some very critical self-reflective opportunities that you have for yourself.
Eugene, may I interrupt for one moment?
Of course.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lasana. We are getting some questions, and there's one related to this topic from Somali on the question of how to assess the risk of bringing your whole self in. How do you support the employee who does not see the relevance of bringing their whole self to work? What questions or tools do you turn to encourage their engagement in this space?
Who would like to take that? Oh, Regina, you're unmuted. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I saw that question earlier, and I think that is a really good question. And I try to figure out, what's the perspective I want to answer that question from in terms of sharing my own, the way I view it, not the right answer. Because I have had, people push and say, well, Dr. Stanback Stroud, you're in a very different point in your career, and so you can afford to do X, Y, Z, take that stance. But I think that one of the things that's important is, regardless of where you are in your career or where you are in terms of your circumstances, you have to determine whether you want to prioritize equity. I don't feel like I have the luxury, no matter where I am, in the beginning of my career, whether I'm unemployed or employed, whether I can, buy the groceries without having to have them tallied up, subtotaled, or not have to think about it and not know the price of something right now because I haven't had to think about it, regardless of where I am in my position, because of my own lived experiences, because of me being raised in these United States, because of me being raised in the segregated South, and then moving to the state of California that has the highest number of white supremacist organizations in the nation. So those lived experiences, and then the scholarship I've engaged in, etc., say to me to prioritize equity and to prioritize anti-racist work. And that means it's prioritized over everything. It's prioritized over my own interests. It's something bigger than me. So I enter these spaces with something that is called courage. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm not afraid, and it doesn't mean that I'm really not worried about some things, but I have to draw on that courage to enter that space in order to do that work. The other thing I do, though, is I bring that lens to when I'm bringing in that employee. So an employee that doesn't see the relevance of bringing their whole self to work, the reality is that I try to make sure that I'm not seduced by a good interview, and that I don't let a bad interview get in the way of me really seeing that talent. And that's part of my responsibility in digging in and understanding and seeing that whole person. So actually, one of the questions that I have asked many candidates is something like, aside from your dog, your cat, your bird, your turtle, your husband or wife, your lover, your girlfriend, your kids, your discipline and education and students, tell me what you really care about. And when I hear what they really care about, I'm looking for something bigger than they are. I'm looking for evidence of that strength. Doesn't mean that I don't always catch it before they get into the organization, but that's part of the hiring process, even so that I can kind of like minimize the need to do that. The other thing is that I try to coach people to shift their perspective. A lot of times the fact that they're trying to make that decision is because they have the privilege of deciding whether to turn it on or off, engage or not engage, etc. And if they have that privilege, then they may decide, for an example, I want to be an ally right now, or, I don't want to do this work. They think all people of color want to work on this work. Well, that's not my thing, So either way, I try to encourage or coach people to be accomplices in the anti-racist work. And that means using their own selves in their positions as well. Not the ally. Allies are, somebody from outside of the perspective that want to support you. I need accomplices to do the good and hard work. Let me wear the safety pin. Let me put the sign in my yard and say Black Lives Matter, etc. I need an accomplice that's going to help do that work. So it's a fair question, but I really do try to coach such that people are thinking about the effort that is bigger than themselves.
Eugene, can I add one thing?
Yes, Chris. Yes, you can.
Sure. I think I'd also sort of respond to the question by asking that individual to think about what effort it requires to edit, right? That isn't neutral in cost. And usually, I mean, I find their examples are helpful and sort of deep, less personal examples. So I've used the example before of I work with law students, right? So you're a law student in criminal law as a 1L, and you're a Black, Brown, or Indigenous person, and a case is talked about, and you see race all over it, right? And it's not brought up. And there's this weird thing that happens, or that is this sort of dissonance around this internal dialogue that starts to form about, like, are they going to bring it up? I wonder if they're going to talk about it. I see it. And you start looking around the room and trying to make eye contact with the other brown people, but like, do you see what I see? Because I see something and nobody's saying it. And then like read their body language and be like, someone going to have my back if I bring it? And then, and then someone else says a comment and you're like, now you're reacting to that. Or maybe you raise your hand and you do say, can we talk about, you're talking about possession laws, and I want to talk about stop and frisk and the impact on and harm on communities of color. And the professor says, well, that's not what we're talking about. That's really interesting, Kristin. That's not what we're talking about today. But feel free to bring it to office hours or something. And then you have this whole weird understandable emotional reaction to that. All of that going on is also happening at a time when you're supposed to be listening to the lecture, right? So I just missed 10 minutes of lecture about the case because I was having an internal dialogue and my friends and I were making faces at each other and trying to figure it out and underlining and writing angry things in my book. And that like is literally a cost to that student where they didn't get the educational benefit that they're paying for. And I think that's an example that is true also in kind of the workplace employee space, right? Like just that it requires effort to think about when to show up, how to show up. It requires effort to think about what to wear, how you're going to do your hair, what color you might wear, what earrings you're putting in today, how you're bringing that, like all of that stuff is time that I suspect, I don't know, that I suspect that, my white male, cis straight colleagues may not be spending or may be spending on other things like doing research that gets seen and rewarded in particular ways. So I don't think anybody has to bring their whole selves in, and people are private and they have different feelings like that. I think you have to respect that. But I think just asking people to think about what are you editing? How much effort is that requiring? And what might you be giving up while you're spending the time doing that? If that calculus still feels right to you, I fully respect that. But I think you have to make the calculus conscious.
I really appreciate that, Kristin. Marcia.
Yeah, so I appreciate everything that's been said. I agree with Regina and Kristin in their comments. And I think I would, of course, add to it just, meeting people where they're at. I think that's a little bit about what Kristin was saying. Like not everybody wants to share their life story and they really shouldn't have to. And at the same time, I think being able to recognize the value of people bringing elements of themselves to spaces to create the teams and the safe spaces that people need to feel that they can be a part of and feel like they can trust, right? And so some of that is just sort of getting to know people at the level that they're comfortable of, right? That they want you to know, or it doesn't have to be family or children or what. It might be that I really like baseball, or I really like knitting, or, just to kind of sort of start to break things down in a way that they can feel the safety in revealing themselves. Because you have to know that people come from prior experiences where maybe that wasn't the case, where they didn't feel safe, or they felt judged or penalized, maybe even in ways, because of their identities or interests or backgrounds. And so I think it is really important to allow people the space to progress in those ways comfortably, and also to use tools that are really objective, right? That can help people break out of those shells where, it might be the strengths finder thing, and you're doing it for your team to really see, what are your individual strengths, and then allowing people to share stories that help them resonate with the strengths that have come out of those assessments. Like, those are some of the ways that maybe you can engage like the whole team in a manner that people can share as much as they may want to share. And so, yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Marcia. I'm going to jump in on this topic because it's one that's really passionate to me. So what we're talking about is stereotype threat. And there's a lot of research out there around stereotype threat. And essentially what's happening is, as Kristin described, because you're thinking about all of these other things, you can't think about the task in front of you. You have a limited amount of cognitive resources. This is brain science. So to the extent you have people who are interested in that, say neuroscience, you can't worry about that and do a good job. It's impossible. You can't worry about that and be successful in the interview. It is impossible. So one of the things tying into the systems that we have here, so we don't give people interview questions in advance typically. We show up on the spot, boom, we spring the questions on you. We want to see how you think on your feet. I think that's stupid. We're going to change. We're actually in the process of changing practices to give people questions in advance because we actually want you to perform your best. And we know that if people have questions in advance, they can think more clearly and answer the questions better and minimize the impact of stereotype threat and actually answer the questions to give you the information that you need as the hiring manager to decide, is this person worth hiring? And we also know from research that women, people of color, people from marginalized backgrounds experience stereotype threat at higher level than other folks do. So when we talk about leveling the playing field, providing interview questions in advance is one way that we level the playing field. It's not giving anybody an advantage, it's leveling the playing field. All right, so my next question, anybody else want to jump in on this before I go to the next question? All right, so the next question. So what advice would you have for managers that are working with people from different cultural backgrounds? So, not every Black person is going to have a Black manager, not every gay person is going to have a gay manager, so on and so forth. So what advice do you have for those people in these cross-cultural, cross-identity relationships, particularly, for example, somebody comes forward and says, I think X is happening to me because of discrimination or bias. But you as the manager don't know what they're talking about because you've never experienced it. You can't really empathize it. How do we handle these situations? Don't all unmute at once. Oh, Marcia, thank you.
So I think the very first thing is just to listen, right? I mean, I think it's so important that people feel heard. And so often that's really just what they need, is to feel heard. But as well, to be able to acknowledge your own shortcomings, right? Like, I have no idea what that's like, to acknowledge that they haven't had that experience. And at the same time, like, showing empathy by just validating the emotions that they're feeling. I've never experienced that, but I can see how much it's really upsetting you. And just being able to ask some open-ended questions, like, how can I support you in trying to address this? How can we strategize ways for you to be able to confront this in the future? As well, like, there are other resources. You don't have to be the one to have all the answers, but to know where to send people, whether it's an ethnic staff organization or a mentoring program, to be able to also direct them to other sources of support. I think that's my initial take.
Regina, you've unmuted.
Yeah, I would say that I would also advise managers to start from a position of respect and an assumption of value of that employee, and an assumption of normalizing the experiences and talent and creativity and thinking and perspective of Black, Indigenous people of color. Even with starting with examining our own ways in which we communicate the information. So a lot of times we will talk about, supporting and serving, for an example, minorities, but, only in, because of the normalization of white culture is, more than 50% considered a minority in the context of race. Or, so we get a chance to kind of just think through our language. Really people are part of the global majority if they're people of color, or the new majority if they're people of color in these United States. And I think that it's also important that we enter with the intent of creating a judgment-free zone, because, a lot of times you're talking about being in the position of being a supervisor or an evaluator in some way, or having some position, some influence or power over the fate of that employee. And so even if you think you're establishing a relationship of coaching and establishing a rapport, that person may not necessarily be able to see you beyond that, your role as an evaluator and a judger and somebody who has an impact on their future. So, you know, creating that rapport and establishing a judgment-free zone is important. And then the other thing I would say is that, you know, take on the responsibility to make yourself smart. Make yourself smart around racial and equity literacy. Be careful not to engage in what Gloria Ladson-Billings calls the poverty of culture, which is, you know, attributing what might be your own deficit-based ideology to their culture. Like, well, you know, they come from a place where they don't value education, or they don't have access to X, or whatever it might be. That may be more representative of a deficit-based ideology than it is about the reality of a culture. So you have to be careful not to engage in the poverty of culture perspective. And then just be responsible. You know, we tend to, you know, particularly in these United States, we tend to you know, make everything a fun thing. And so we'll have taco night, and we'll have, you know, different types of things. And we miss the depth of the literacy that we can get from addressing different things. So I would say that it's important for us to just be responsible around that in terms of our own racial and cultural literacy. And then finally, I would go with, you know, what the other panelists have been saying, which is about listening and learning and entering that conversation, understanding that even as the coach, you have much to gain from your involvement and from coaching that individual, particularly if they come from a different experience, background, religion, culture, you know, race, history, etc. Then you have much to gain, which means the institution has much to gain. So don't miss that opportunity.
Thank you, Regina. Lasana.
Yeah, if I could chime in, thank you for paying attention to the mute icon. When I do any work, before I really start speaking to the subject at hand or engaging people on the subject at hand, the first thing we have to do is we have to question our assumptions, and our assumptions come from narratives that we've adopted. And one of the assumptions that people have in the workplace and in society, that there's such thing as benign neutrality, right? That there's a neutrality, and by being neutral, right, by not talking about race, gender, sexual orientation, you're keeping the status quo. But what you don't understand is not benign, because the status quo continues to produce what? Racist, sexist, and anti-LGBTQ outcomes. So there is no benign neutrality, but we think that we can take this position of, if I don't bring up these things, right? If I talk to them about these other subjects, right, that aren't as charged, right, then we're fine. But what we don't understand is that the status quo, us talking about our favorite desserts, us talking about our favorite trips out of the country, us talking about our favorite music, right, still produces racist, sexist, and anti-LGBTQ outcomes. So if we're not actively, in some kind of way, and activism doesn't mean have a sign, rah, 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 always petitioning, right? It's about surveying your environment, looking at the changes, and then deciding what's the best way to engage to see that change. So that's the first thing. This assumption about benign neutrality is problematic, right? That there's a neutrality around these issues. The second thing is that it's imperative that everyone within the organization, regardless of their background, have an understanding and become either culturally competent and or racial literacy. And so Sonia Douglas Horford, out of the Teachers College at Columbia, I think she's at Columbia University or NYU, she says, racial literacy is knowing what race is, how it works, and its impact on equality, and in our case, on inequity. And so if we really don't know what it is, we think racism is about interpersonal relationships, or people being nice to each other, or people who use slurs and people who don't use slurs. We are going to have a totally different approach versus an understanding that this is about a system that produces outcomes. And by design, since the 1960s, is designed to look at on face value as neutral, right? Because it became politically incorrect to use particular groups, right, in documents, in policies, in practices, to put up signs that say this group can do this and this group can't do that. They said, well, why don't we put in assessments? Why don't we put in certain kinds of exams, right? Why don't we put in certain kinds of other kinds of barriers and structures and hoops that people have to jump over? Why don't we make some kind of financial threshold? Because these groups tend to not have this financial threshold. But see, it seems benign on the cover. It's like, you just can't afford it. But it's a reason why you can't afford it, right? You know, you saw that with the argument people were talking about country clubs memberships, right? They're like, we don't discriminate against so-and-so. It's just that you got to pay $250,000 a year. Well, how many people of color have $250,000 a year in disposable income, right? That's a way to benignly say, it's not because of your race, bro. It's because that's just what the membership is, baby. And so this benign neutrality, these assumptions that we have, that by talking about cherry pie and talking about the weather is going to keep us having to deal with the realities of sexism, racism, and anti-LGBTQ sentiment, it's just a false facade and a fantasy. But I'm not saying everybody needs to be Assata Shakur. Everybody doesn't need to be Leonard Peltier, right? I'm not saying you need to be that type of activist. What I'm saying is that you have to understand what race is, right? What gender is, what sexual orientation is, how it works in this society, in your workplace, and how it impacts in inequality and inequity.
So Lasana, I'm going to ask you a follow-up and then I'll go to Regina. So in your role as the Director for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging, I would think you have some influence over how we approach as a campus diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And you mentioned racial literacy, and we need to have some racial literacy. What would you recommend for the campus to do about this?
Well, my recommendation to do something like this is multi-pronged. Like, one thing is we think we can do a bunch of trainings, but as they say in the fitness world, you can't train your way over a bad diet. You can't eat donuts all day and then work out an hour and think that you're going to get the results, right? So we first have to monitor our diets, right? We have to question our assumptions. And the way in which you do that in a large organization is three ways. You do what we're doing now. You have to have a community of practice where people who have similar interests begin to organize around that, and they begin to educate themselves and others. And that way you're able to have this consistent environment of education, praxis, and assessment, right? That's sustainable, that's held within a group. So communities of practice are really some of the best ways within corporate and non-corporate entities to foster this type of racial literacy. Then you do have trainings and professional learning experiences, but they're very targeted and they're cohorted. This buckshot approach, like, hey, we're going to put out a flyer and we're going to have such and such and such and such speak, and whoever shows up, and whoever don't, that doesn't give you that concentrated experience that people have to do. These one-offs have to go away. It has to be a protracted experience. And then lastly, everybody within the organization, based on their particular level of interest, has to be exposed to literature, whether that literature is TED Talks, like I see coming up in the chat, or whether it's articles, or whether it's actual text that deals with all of these issues. And they have a place like a community of practice or a cohorted professional learning experience where they can have meaningful conversations about these things.
And I assume something like this is in the works?
Yes, something like this is in the works. Right now, we're engaging, starting next week, in a process within People and Culture, with a cohorted process of cultural fluency, professional learning experiences that once we assess that first cohort, then we're going to talk about how do we move into the broader campus community.
Thank you.
Thank you for the alley-oop. I hope I dunked it.
Regina.
Yeah, I was just going to add to some of the previous comments that Lasana made, and that is about our responsibility to not get distracted by what Paul Gorski calls equity detours, where there are these, common, whataboutisms that go on in order to distract us from addressing, the issues of equity. And so what really Lasana is talking about is, understanding the different layers of racism that contribute to inequity. So whether you're talking about the socio-historical layer of racism, or the ideological perspective that somebody has of racism, or the individual racism. I noticed that somebody put in the chat, yeah, what about, people of color that are racist, or racism within communities of color, et cetera. Or whether you're talking about institutional racism or structural racism, one of the things that I commonly would just remind myself, when I would get distracted, because really the goal of racism is to distract. And as long as you're distracted over here, then you're not paying attention to those things over there. And I really appreciate what Kristin said with regard to being consumed with, different issues, so much so that you're not that you're missing the thing that everybody else gets to enjoy, whether it's getting the things from the lecture or showing up in the budget committee or whatever it might be. But one of the things that I would commonly say is, look, what people think about me is not my business. So the fact that you wear a hood and you don't like Black people, that's your business. What I care about is when you take that hood off, you're not in the police department, that you're not a part of you're not the judge that's sitting in the bench, that you're not a part of the teaching staff, that you're not a part of the societal institutions that are part of the structure that we use in order to, advance in order to live our lives, right? So that is just an addition that I wanted to make to Lasana's comments about how you engage.
Thank you, Regina. Kristin.
Oh, I just wanted to go back to your, I think, very concrete question and suggest, right, which I think was somebody walks into your office and says, it seems like I've been denied an opportunity to do something, and I think it's based on race or gender or sexual orientation or something, ableism. And I would just say for us as managers to think about how the response, I'll give you a couple of examples of responses and think about how they feel different, right? One is, gosh, I'm sure that's not the case, but tell me why you think that is. One is, oh my gosh, that's terrible. What can I do to fix it? One is, that doesn't sound racist to me, but what do you want me to do? And the last might be, tell me more. And then let's talk about what next steps might be. And one distinction, I think that may be true for managers who also identify as Black, Indigenous people of color, is that we have a luxury of being unsurprised, right? I'm not surprised when you come into my office and you're like, hey, I think this happened and I think it might be because of race. I don't know whether that's accurate or not. I need you to tell me more, right? And then to talk about next steps. But it doesn't sound outlandish. And not being surprised actually is something anybody can work towards. So not being surprised requires you to do some things that others have suggested around self-education, about systems and structures and the way they've operated, not just with, but also for purpose, right? Not just behind the scenes, but to an end. And anybody can do that. And there's lots of ways. There's I think nowadays, good exercises and things to read, and we've all done a pretty good job recently of putting those out there. But you cannot be surprised when someone says, it's not even I think that person was racist, but I think the fact that that opportunity was not advertised to everybody in a certain kind of way made it seem like I didn't have the same opportunity to potentially participate in that training or something along those lines. So work towards not being surprised.
I think that's a very important point, Kristin. I've been working in HR for several years, so nothing really surprises me anymore. But so sometimes I lose the perspective of a manager who might go 10 years in their career and never heard about something like that. These things happen on a far too regular basis. So no one should be surprised if somebody comes in their office one day. And the other thing, sort of your sample answers is, well, I really know Kristin. I don't think she meant anything by it. No, you don't. No, you do not. Do not presume to know anything about anybody's intent when they said something or did something. You don't know what's in somebody's mind, and you can't read it. Again, and as Marcia said, she's unclicking, I will transition to her. We need to do a lot of listening and asking. And it's not listening because you're waiting to jump into the conversation. It's listening to really hear what that person's saying. Go ahead, Marcia.
So, I just want to point out, one of the great challenges of all of this is how exciting it is to hear the things that Lasana is describing and the ways that Kristin and Regina are encouraging people to educate themselves. And then there are those people who need more motivation, right, to actually do that self-work. So I'm bringing that up in a way to say, like, I know that we're making steps in terms of like the Achieve Together model, performance and all of that. But there, like, so many times it feels like preaching to the choir. Like the people that are in spaces doing the learning are the people who really want to do the learning. And I'm not saying that they don't need to do the learning, because everybody needs to learn. But at the same time, how do we draw the people who are like, I don't need that, or that's not my priority, and they're having an impact on numbers of people who, just don't have the power or the energy to be able to manage the experiences that they have. You hear what I'm saying, right? Like, how do we make it a part of, and the M word, right? The mandatory word, which is so forbidden at different levels, is around mandatory training. But, we want to aspire to a place where you don't have to mandate that training, where it's more of a cultural expectation, that the community as a whole embraces and empowers people to seek that out. But we're not there. And so I guess I'm sort of asking the question of, how is it that we address that part? Because I think it's inspiring to hear everything that is out there and being done, but, how do we get the horse to the water?
So it will be mandatory. So, I don't know that I've ever had a big meeting where I've shared my vision kind of thing, but it's clear to me that I want this to be a place where everybody feels like they belong, like they can be themselves, right? All of the cliches, but I actually mean them. And how do you get there? Part of it is by bringing in people to the organization who already adopt those values. So we changed the About Berkeley. Now it says we want to hire equity-minded people. It says, if your values don't align with ours, you don't want to work here. It should be that clear. I also want to make it very uncomfortable for people who are already here who don't subscribe to those values. I want you to feel so uncomfortable, you go look for work somewhere else. And mandatory, I was told when I started, we don't do mandatory here. That's folklore. We do mandatory, because now we have mandatory training for all managers, right? By 2022 or 23, if you didn't do Berkeley People Management, you're not eligible for merit. You know what's part of Berkeley People Management? That unconscious bias certificate. Gotcha, right? This training that Lasana is developing, we're not doing it just for people and culture. This is something that will become more widespread, that the way I envision it, when you have your new employee orientation, you get your first little taste of this training. We've already changed the new employee orientation to start talking about equity. That's the first thing we're going to talk about when you show up for new employee orientation. And then you're going to roll into this cohorted experience that everybody will need to do. It will take time, right? We have a lot of people who work here, and there's only Lasana and a couple of other people, but we're going to work it out so that eventually this becomes a place where, if you work here, you're going to do this training. And that's part of the reason why you want to work here and why you want to stay here, because ultimately, if we do it well, the work atmosphere will be one where everybody feels like they can be themselves, right? And that's ultimately what you want. So that's the master plan. All right, so we have 5 more minutes. Isela, can I pose one more question to the group? So the question, and anybody can jump in, is, so for those people who are like, what, I really want to get that coaching, but I'm not getting it from my manager. How do I get that? What do I need to do? What advice would you have for those people? Don't everybody jump in. Regina, thank you.
Yeah, so Eugene, if I'm understanding your question, you're asking, they're not getting it from their manager, but they really are interested in coaching, and where should they go in the institution, or how should they get the coaching?
Or how do they even have a conversation with their manager to say, hey, coach me up?
Well, I was going to start with that. I was going to start with that, because the UC Berkeley has invested in training managers in coaching, which is a pretty impressive investment. Quite frankly, I think you guys have more than 600 people that have been trained. That's a pretty impressive investment. And because UC Berkeley has said to the supervisors that this is part of your your responsibility in terms of your job description. And because we typically make those things that are part of your responsibility and job description, things that determine and impact your continued employment, your promotions, your merit, your salaries, you know, those types of things. One, you have a foundation to approach the person about being a coach. But the last thing you want is somebody to have to coach somebody that doesn't want to do the coaching. The last thing somebody who needs the coaching is to be coached by somebody who's not committed to it and doesn't want to do it. So the next thing I would say to them is, first of all, you know, approach your supervisor, because it may not be that they don't want to coach you. It may be that they need that kind of support and help to be reminded that, you know, they actually can have an impact on you. The second thing is, if it's not that supervisor, then I would also encourage people to look to others that they are interested in being coached by and ask for that, and just reach out for that kind of support. And then, because so many people are going through coaching and being trained as coaches at different levels of the organization, if you have been trained and you are interested in that coaching, then engage in some peer coaching. So there are many of you that may have been trained as coaches, as well as receive coaching in your positions. It is really, really valuable to exchange that coaching support and service with your peers who have gone through that training as well. So that's 3 possible ways that you can get to that.
Thank you, Regina. And with the final 2 minutes, I want to pass it back to Isela and Colin to tell us how we're going to bring this to a close on time.
Love producing some live television. Wanted to say thank you all so much for your incredible, just vulnerable, authentic stories that you told today. We're getting a lot of really positive feedback about how just real today was. Thank you, Eugene, for moderating so artfully. And with 30 seconds to go in our show today, you've got some resources available to you on campus. Thanks for folks who have been dropping those into the chat along the way. Please fill out the survey. That'll help us get better at providing new, rich content in this space, as well as figuring out what can we do to practice some of the things that we learned when we get to our session in December. So thanks again, and I'll pass it over to Isela for closing us out.
So then we will share all this with all the panelists, even those outside, and anyone who showed up here, regardless of whether or not you have access to our internal. I want to really just say thank you again for everyone for inviting us in these really challenging times into your spaces. It's very intimate to be able to be in your personal spaces, professional spaces, wherever you are. Big shout out to Cal Coaching Network leadership team, my co-chair Colin, as always, Kristin Brooks and Nancy Donovan for programs and learning, Immaculate Adesida, who reached out to the ethnic staff orgs for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, Paul Garnett, who does our communities and networks, and Katie Carson, who's gotten shout outs as well already for assessment records and also communication. So Katie and Colin are the ones who put out our newsletter. Thank you so much for everyone who signed up for our listserv. We will be following up with you. Big gratitude. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I got a message from someone in the chat just saying to make a recommendation to share some shout outs to other folks in this space who have been integral in this change story, like Barbara Broke, Angela Stopper, Joe McNess, Ying Kwa, Sierra White was in this space today. I think Pam Rich was there. So if we've forgotten to say thank you for moving, the ship of UC Berkeley towards this better coaching culture, the stronger coaching culture, this work continues, and we thank you all so much for your incredible work. With that, we hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and this session will be up online in the coming weeks. Thank you so much, and see you soon.